Jonathan Jackson stood in the narrow hallway outside Christopher Perez's apartment, holding a black hoodie that had somehow become the most important piece of clothing in his life. The fabric felt warm in his hands, still carrying traces of Christopher's cologne mixed with something indefinably him. What should have been a simple 30-second exchange had stretched into 20 minutes of conversation that neither of them seemed willing to end. Christopher leaned against his door frame, one shoulder pressed into the white-painted wood, his dark hair slightly messed from running his fingers through it. He wore a simple gray t-shirt and jeans, but something about the way he looked at Jonathan made the mundane feel electric. The hallway lighting cast soft shadows across his face, highlighting the gentle curve of his smile and the way his eyes seemed to hold questions he wasn't quite ready to ask. "I should probably give this back to you," Jonathan said for the third time, but he made no move to hand over the hoodie. Instead, he found himself studying the way Christopher's fingers drummed against the doorframe, a nervous habit he'd noticed months ago but never really paid attention to until recently. "You should," Christopher agreed, but he didn't reach for it either. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, that familiar gesture that always made Jonathan's chest tighten with something he couldn't name. "But I'm not really in a rush to get it back." The words hung between them in the narrow space, loaded with meaning that Jonathan wasn't sure he was interpreting correctly. He'd been Christopher's friend for 2 years now, ever since they'd been assigned as roommates in their sophomore year of college. He knew Christopher's habits, his favorite coffee order, the way he hummed unconsciously when he was concentrating on homework. He knew that Christopher always borrowed his hoodies when they studied together late into the night, claiming the library was too cold. What Jonathan didn't know was when exactly he'd started paying attention to the way Christopher's eyes crinkled when he laughed, or how his stomach had begun doing strange flip-flops whenever Christopher would casually drape an arm around his shoulders during movie nights. He definitely didn't know when he'd started lying awake at night, replaying conversations and wondering what it meant when Christopher would let their hands brush while reaching for the same book. "The thing is," Christopher continued, his voice softer now, almost hesitant, "I keep thinking about something you said last week, about how sometimes we hold on to things because letting go feels like losing something important." Jonathan's breath caught. He remembered that conversation, late at night in their shared living room, both of them supposedly studying, but really just talking about everything and nothing. He'd been thinking about his ex-girlfriend Emma, about how he'd known for months that their relationship wasn't working, but had been too afraid to end it. But now, looking at Christopher's face in the dim hallway light, he wondered if they'd been talking about something else entirely. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you were watching from and hype this video in the comments because this story is about to take you on an emotional journey you won't forget. The hoodie had become a symbol of something Jonathan couldn't quite articulate. It had started innocently enough, Christopher borrowing it during a particularly cold study session 3 weeks ago. But instead of returning it the next day, Christopher had kept it, wearing it around their apartment with an ease that made Jonathan's heart race. When Jonathan had finally worked up the courage to ask for it back, Christopher had looked almost disappointed, but he'd agreed to return it. That had been yesterday. Now here they were, and Jonathan found himself reluctant to take back the one tangible connection he had to the confusing feelings that had been building inside him for months. "What are you really asking me, Chris?" Jonathan heard himself say, surprised by the directness of his own question. The nickname slipped out naturally, the way it always did when they were alone, but tonight it felt different, more intimate. Christopher's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment Jonathan thought he had overstepped some invisible boundary. But then Christopher's expression softened, and he took a small step closer, close enough that Jonathan could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "I'm asking," Christopher said slowly, as if he was figuring out the words as he spoke them, "if you've ever felt like you were waiting for something without knowing what it was. Like you were holding your breath for a moment that might never come." The hallway suddenly felt smaller, the space between them charged with an energy that made Jonathan's skin tingle. He clutched the hoodie tighter, using it as an anchor to keep himself grounded when everything else felt like it was shifting beneath his feet. "Every day," Jonathan whispered, the admission falling from his lips before he could stop it. "For months now. Every single day." The confession hung in the air between them, and Jonathan watched as understanding dawned slowly across Christopher's face. It was like watching the sun rise, gradual and then all at once, illuminating everything that had been hidden in shadow. But to understand how they had arrived at this moment, suspended in a hallway that had become the most important place in Jonathan's world, it was necessary to go back to the beginning, back to 3 months earlier, when everything had still seemed simple and Jonathan had still believed he understood himself completely. It had been a Tuesday night in early October when everything started to change, though Jonathan wouldn't realize it until much later. He'd been sprawled across their living room couch, textbooks scattered around him like fallen leaves, trying to make sense of his organic chemistry homework. The apartment had been quiet except for the soft sound of Christopher moving around in the kitchen, making his third cup of coffee of the evening. Christopher had emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 mugs, setting one down on the coffee table within Jonathan's reach without being asked. It was such a small gesture, so automatic and considerate, that it shouldn't have made Jonathan's chest feel warm, but it did. "You look like you're about to set that textbook on fire with your mind," Christopher had said, settling onto the couch beside Jonathan with an easy familiarity that they'd developed over months of shared study sessions. "I'm considering it," Jonathan had replied, rubbing his eyes with the heels of his hands. Maybe the flames would make more sense than these molecular structures. Christopher had laughed, that rich sound that always made something flutter in Jonathan's stomach, and reached over to turn Jonathan's textbook toward himself. "Here, let me see. Sometimes a fresh perspective helps." As Christopher had leaned closer to examine the page, Jonathan had become acutely aware of everything about him. The way his hair fell across his forehead when he concentrated. The small scar on his chin from a childhood accident he'd told Jonathan about months ago. The warmth radiating from his body in the small space between them on the couch. It was the first time Jonathan had noticed these details with such startling clarity, as if someone had adjusted the focus on a camera he hadn't realized he'd been looking through. The realization had been both thrilling and terrifying, a door opening onto a landscape he'd never imagined exploring. "You know what your problem is?" Christopher had said, looking up from the textbook with a grin that made Jonathan's heart skip. "You're overthinking it. Sometimes the answer is simpler than you think." Jonathan had stared at him for a moment, wondering if Christopher was talking about chemistry or something else entirely. "Simple," he'd repeated, testing the word on his tongue. "Simple," Christopher had confirmed, and then he'd launched into an explanation of molecular bonding that actually made sense, his enthusiasm infectious as he gestured with his hands to illustrate his points. But Jonathan had found himself only half listening to the chemistry lesson. Instead, he'd been mesmerized by the animation in Christopher's face, the way his eyes lit up when he was explaining something he understood. He'd watched Christopher's hands as they moved through the air, strong and graceful, and had found himself wondering what it would feel like to reach out and catch one of those hands in his own. The thought had startled him so much that he jerked back slightly, nearly knocking over his coffee mug in the process. Christopher had caught it smoothly, his fingers brushing against Jonathan's in the process, and the brief contact had sent electricity shooting up Jonathan's arm. "Careful," Christopher had said softly, his hand lingering on Jonathan's for just a moment longer than necessary. "Wouldn't want to ruin all your hard work." Jonathan had nodded mutely, not trusting his voice, and had tried to focus on the textbook again. But the words had blurred together on the page, his mind too busy processing the implications of what he'd just felt to concentrate on organic chemistry. That night, lying in his bed with the wall between his room and Christopher's seeming thinner than usual, Jonathan had stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of what was happening to him. He'd dated girls throughout high school and his first year of college. He'd been in a relationship with Emma Gomez for 6 months, and while it hadn't been passionate, it had been comfortable and familiar. But what he'd felt sitting on that couch with Christopher had been anything but comfortable. It had been electric and overwhelming and completely outside his experience. It had made him question everything he thought he knew about himself. The next few weeks had passed in a haze of hyper-awareness. Jonathan had found himself cataloging every interaction with Christopher, searching for signs that he wasn't alone in this new understanding of their friendship. He'd noticed things he'd never paid attention to before. The way Christopher's gaze would linger on him sometimes when he thought Jonathan wasn't looking. How Christopher always seemed to find excuses to touch him casually, a hand on his shoulder, fingers brushing when they passed books back and forth. Most significantly, Jonathan had started to notice how Christopher talked about his dating life, or rather, how he didn't talk about it. While their other friends constantly discussed their romantic escapades, Christopher remained curiously quiet on the subject. When pressed, he would make vague comments about not having met the right person yet, or about feeling like something was missing in his relationships. The realization that he might not be alone in his confusion had been both exhilarating and terrifying. Jonathan had found himself walking a careful line, trying to be supportive and available without pushing too hard or revealing too much. It was an exhausting balance, made more complicated by the fact that he was still trying to understand his own feelings. The hoodie situation had started innocently enough. Christopher had been complaining about how cold the library was during their late-night study sessions, and Jonathan had impulsively offered to let him borrow one of his sweatshirts. It was a simple gray hoodie, nothing special. But when Christopher had pulled it on over his t-shirt, something had shifted in Jonathan's chest. Maybe it was the way the hoodie was slightly too big on Christopher's frame, making him look younger and softer than usual. Maybe it was the way Christopher had unconsciously pulled the sleeves over his hands, a gesture so endearing that Jonathan had to look away to hide his visuma. Or maybe it was simply the sight of Christopher wearing something that belonged to him, a visible connection between them that felt more intimate than it should have. Better? Jonathan had asked, his voice coming out rougher than he'd intended. Christopher had nodded, tugging the hood up over his hair with a grin that made Jonathan's heart stutter. Much better. Thanks, John. The nickname had always been casual between them, but hearing it while Christopher wore his clothes had felt different, more personal, like a secret they were sharing without acknowledging it. That study session had been one of their most productive, but also one of the most torturous for Jonathan. He'd spent the entire evening hyper-aware of Christopher beside him, of the way he'd absently played with the hoodie's drawstrings while he read, of how he'd burrowed deeper into the soft fabric when he got tired. When they'd finally packed up to leave, Christopher had started to pull the hoodie off, but Jonathan had stopped him with a quick gesture. Keep it, he'd said, trying to sound casual. It's cold outside and you've got further to walk to your car. Christopher had looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression. Are you sure? I'm sure, Jonathan had replied, and he'd meant it. The thought of Christopher wearing his hoodie, carrying a piece of him into the night, had been worth the loss of a favorite sweatshirt. But Christopher hadn't returned it the next day, or the day after that. Instead, he'd worn it around their apartment with an ease that suggested he'd forgotten it wasn't his. Jonathan had found himself looking forward to glimpses of Christopher in the gray fabric, the sight becoming a small, bright spot in his increasingly complicated emotional landscape. The situation had come to a head 2 weeks later, when Jonathan had been doing laundry and had realized he was running out of warm clothes. He'd knocked on Christopher's door, intending to ask for the hoodie back, but when Christopher had answered wearing it, the words had died in Jonathan's throat. Christopher had been fresh from a shower, his hair still damp and curling slightly at the edges. The hoodie had hung loose on his frame, the sleeves pushed up to reveal his forearms, and he'd looked so comfortable and at home in Jonathan's clothes that asking for it back had felt like asking him to give up a part of himself. Hey, Christopher had said, his voice soft and slightly husky from sleep. What's up? Jonathan had stood there for a moment, drinking in the sight of him, before forcing himself to speak. I was just wondering if I could get my hoodie back. I'm doing laundry and I'm running low on warm stuff. Something had flickered across Christopher's face, too quick for Jonathan to interpret, but he'd nodded immediately. Of course, sorry, I didn't realize I'd had it for so long. He'd started to pull it off right there in the doorway, and Jonathan had caught a glimpse of the pale skin of his stomach as the fabric had ridden up. The sight had sent heat shooting through him, and he'd quickly looked away. You don't have to give it back right now, Jonathan had said quickly. Whenever you're done with it is fine. Christopher had paused, the hoodie halfway over his head, and had looked at Jonathan with an expression that seemed to see right through him. Okay, he'd said slowly. I'll get it back to you soon. But soon had turned into another week, and then another. Jonathan had found himself in the strange position of missing his own clothing while simultaneously loving the sight of Christopher wearing it. It had become a symbol of something he couldn't name, a physical representation of the connection he felt growing between them. The breaking point had come during a conversation with their mutual friend Brian Lopez, who had been visiting for the weekend. They'd been sitting in the living room, Christopher curled up in the corner of the couch wearing the infamous hoodie, when Brian had made a casual comment about how domestic they seemed. "You guys are like an old married couple," Brian had said with a laugh, gesturing between them. Jonathan lending Christopher his clothes, Christopher making Jonathan coffee without being asked. "It's actually kind of cute." The comment had hung in the air for a moment, and Jonathan had felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment. But when he'd glanced at Christopher, expecting to see similar discomfort, he'd instead found Christopher looking thoughtful, almost contemplative. "Is that what it looks like?" Christopher had asked quietly, his fingers absently playing with the hoodie's hem. Brian had shrugged, oblivious to the undercurrents in the room. "I mean, yeah, you guys have this whole domestic thing going on. It's sweet." After Brian had left, Jonathan and Christopher had found themselves alone in an apartment that suddenly felt charged with unspoken tension. They'd moved around each other carefully, both of them seeming to sense that something had shifted, but neither willing to acknowledge it directly. It was that night that Jonathan had finally worked up the courage to ask for his hoodie back. Not because he particularly needed it, but because he'd felt like they needed to address what was happening between them. The hoodie had become a symbol of all the things they weren't saying, and he'd hoped that by reclaiming it, he might force some kind of conversation about where they stood. Christopher had agreed immediately, but there had been something in his eyes that looked almost like disappointment. He'd promised to return it the next day, but when the next day had come, he'd asked for one more night with it. "I know it's weird," he'd said, not quite meeting Jonathan's eyes, "but it's really comfortable, and I've got this big presentation tomorrow. It feels like good luck or something." Jonathan had agreed, of course, because he would have agreed to almost anything Christopher asked of him, but he'd also recognized the request for what it was, a delaying tactic that suggested Christopher was just as reluctant to break this strange connection as Jonathan was, which had led them to tonight, to this moment in the hallway where Christopher was finally returning the hoodie, but neither of them seemed able to complete the transaction. "I've been thinking," Christopher said now, his voice barely above a whisper in the quiet hallway, "about what Brian said, about how we look like a couple." Jonathan's heart started beating so hard he was sure Christopher could hear it. And I realized that I didn't mind it," Christopher continued, his eyes never leaving Jonathan's face. "I didn't mind the idea of people thinking we were together. In fact, I kind of liked it." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Jonathan felt his grip tighten on the hoodie, using it as an anchor in a moment that felt like it could change everything. "Chris," he said softly, testing the waters, "what are you saying?" Christopher took another small step closer, and now they were close enough that Jonathan could see the rapid rise and fall of his chest, could smell the familiar scent of his shampoo mixed with something that was purely him. "I'm saying that I think I've been lying to myself," Christopher said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke, "about what I want, about how I feel about you." Jonathan felt the world tilt on its axis. Everything he thought he knew about their friendship suddenly recontextualized in the light of Christopher's words. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Months," Christopher admitted, running a hand through his hair in that nervous gesture Jonathan had come to love. "Maybe longer. I think part of me has known for a while, but I was too scared to admit it, even to myself." The honesty in Christopher's voice, the vulnerability he was showing, made something inside Jonathan's chest crack open. All the careful walls he'd built around his feelings came tumbling down, leaving him exposed and breathless. "I thought I was going crazy," Jonathan confessed, the words spilling out of him like water from a broken dam. "I kept telling myself I was imagining things, that I was reading too much into every look, every touch. I was so afraid of ruining our friendship." Christopher's eyes softened, and he reached out slowly, giving Jonathan plenty of time to pull away. When Jonathan didn't move, Christopher's fingers brushed against his free hand, the contact sending electricity up his arm just like it had that first night on the couch. "You weren't imagining anything," Christopher said quietly. "I've been trying so hard to act normal, to pretend like nothing had changed, but everything has changed. The way I see you, the way I feel when you're around, the way I feel when you're not around." Jonathan felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, overwhelmed by the relief of finally hearing his own feelings reflected back at him. "I've been in love with you for months," he whispered, the confession falling from his lips like a prayer. "I didn't even know I could feel this way about another guy. But then there was you, and suddenly everything made sense." The word love seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy with meaning and possibility. Christopher's eyes widened, and for a moment Jonathan worried that he'd said too much, moved too fast. But then Christopher was stepping even closer, close enough that Jonathan could feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough that he could count the freckles scattered across Christopher's nose. "Say it again," Christopher whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I love you," Jonathan said, stronger this time, more certain. "I love the way you make coffee for both of us without thinking about it. I love how you get excited when you're explaining something you understand. I love the way you look in my clothes. I love how safe I feel when you're around." Christopher's breath caught, and Jonathan could see the exact moment when the last of his defenses crumbled. "I love you too," Christopher said, his voice breaking slightly on the words. "I love you so much it scares me." The confession hung between them like a living thing, pulsing with the weight of months of unspoken longing. Jonathan felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to leap into something vast and unknown and terrifying and wonderful. "What happens now?" Jonathan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Christopher's hand found his face, fingers tracing the line of his jaw with a gentleness that made Jonathan's breath catch. "Now we stop pretending," Christopher said softly. "Now we stop being afraid." "I'm still afraid," also we did, Jonathan admitted it, leaning into the touch despite his words. "Me too," Christopher said with a small smile. "But I'm more afraid of not trying. I'm more afraid of wondering what if for the rest of my life." The hoodie was still clutched in Jonathan's hand, but it seemed less important now, just a piece of fabric that had somehow become the catalyst for the most important conversation of his life. He looked down at it, then back up at Christopher's face. "You know," he said, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, "you can keep the hoodie. I think it looks better on you anyway." Christopher laughed, the sound bright and relieved and full of joy. "Are you sure? It's your favorite." "I'm sure," Jonathan said, and he meant it. "Besides, I like the idea of you wearing something of mine. It feels right." Christopher's eyes softened, and he leaned his forehead against Jonathan's, their breath mingling in the small space between them. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, his voice so quiet Jonathan almost didn't hear it. Jonathan's heart stopped, then started again at double speed. "Please," he whispered. Christopher's lips were soft against his, tentative at first, as if he was still afraid this might be a dream he could wake up from. But when Jonathan kissed him back, when he dropped the hoodie to the floor so he could cup Christopher's face in both hands, the kiss deepened into something desperate and certain and right. They kissed like people who had been holding their breath for months and were finally allowed to breathe. They kissed like they were trying to make up for all the time they'd lost dancing around their feelings. They kissed like they were writing the first page of a story they'd both been too afraid to start. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Christopher rested his forehead against Jonathan's again. "Wow," he breathed. "Yeah," Jonathan agreed, his voice rough. "Wow." They stood there for a moment, just breathing each other in, adjusting to this new reality where they were allowed to touch, allowed to want, allowed to love each other openly. "So," Christopher said eventually, a grin spreading across his face, "want to come inside? We probably shouldn't have our first real conversation as a couple in the hallway." Jonathan laughed, the sound bubbling up from somewhere deep in his chest. "I'd like that," he said, then paused. "We're a couple now?" "If you want to be," Christopher said, suddenly uncertain again. "I mean, we don't have to label it right away if you're not ready." "I want to be bonding," Jonathan said quickly, reaching for Christopher's hand. "I want to be whatever you want us to be as long as we're together." Christopher's smile was brilliant, lighting up his entire face. Together, he repeated, like he was testing the word. I like the sound of that. They bent down together to pick up the forgotten hoodie, their hand brushing as they both reached for it. Christopher got to it first, holding it up between them. You know, he said thoughtfully, think this hoodie might be lucky after all. Jonathan laughed. Lucky how? Well, it brought us together, didn't it? Christopher said, pulling the hoodie over his head. If you hadn't let me borrow it, we might never have had this conversation. I think we would have found our way to each other eventually, Jonathan said, watching Christopher settle the familiar gray fabric around his shoulders. Some things are just meant to be. Christopher reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers with an ease that felt like they'd been doing it for years instead of minutes. Come on, he said, tugging Jonathan toward his open apartment door. Let's go figure out what comes next. As they crossed the threshold together, Jonathan felt like he was stepping into a new version of his life, one where he didn't have to hide his feelings or second-guess every interaction, one where the person he loved most in the world loved him back. Inside Christopher's apartment, they settled onto his couch with a familiarity that felt both exactly the same and completely different from all the times before. Christopher curled up against Jonathan's side, his head resting on Jonathan's shoulder, and Jonathan wrapped his arms around him like he'd been wanting to do for months. This feels right, Christopher murmured against Jonathan's neck, his breath warm against his skin. It does, Jonathan agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of Christopher's head. It feels like coming home. They talked for hours that night, sharing all the moments they'd been too afraid to acknowledge before. Christopher told him about the night he'd realized he was attracted to men, lying in his bed and thinking about Jonathan's smile. Jonathan told him about the first time he'd wanted to kiss him, during a late-night study session when Christopher had fallen asleep against his shoulder. They talked about their fears, about what it would mean for their friendship, about how to navigate this new territory they were entering together. They talked about the future, tentative and hopeful, painting pictures of what their life together might look like. As the night wore on, they found themselves lying down on the couch, Christopher's back pressed against Jonathan's chest, Jonathan's arms wrapped securely around him. The hoodie had ridden up slightly, and Jonathan could feel the warmth of Christopher's skin beneath his hands. I can't believe this is real, Christopher whispered into the darkness. It's real, Jonathan assured him, tightening his hold. We're real. I love you, Christopher said, like he was testing the words, seeing how they felt in his mouth. I love you too, Jonathan replied, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. They fell asleep like that, tangled together on Christopher's current, the hoodie that had started it all, keeping them warm through the night. When Jonathan woke up the next morning to find Christopher still in his arms, still wearing his clothes, still choosing him, he knew that everything had changed for the better. The hoodie became a symbol of their relationship after that, a tangible reminder of the night they'd finally stopped pretending and started living their truth. Christopher wore it when he was missing Jonathan, when he needed comfort, when he wanted to feel close to him. Jonathan never asked for it back again. 3 months later, they were officially living together, Christopher's lease having expired and both of them realizing they didn't want to spend another night apart. The hoodie had been joined by other shared clothes, shared books, shared everything. Their friends had taken the news of their relationship with varying degrees of surprise, but everyone agreed they seemed happier, more themselves than they'd ever been apart. Brian Lopez, who had unknowingly been the catalyst for their confession with his comment about them looking like a married couple, took full credit for getting them together. I knew it all along, he claimed, though both Jonathan and Christopher remembered his genuine surprise when they told him they were dating. But none of that mattered as much as the quiet moments they shared. The easy domesticity that had always been there but was now acknowledged and celebrated. The way Christopher would steal Jonathan's hoodies and Jonathan would pretend to be annoyed while secretly loving it. The way they'd curl up together for movie nights, no longer careful about maintaining distance. The way they'd make coffee for each other in the mornings, a ritual that had become even more meaningful now that it was accompanied by sleepy kisses and whispered endearments. On their 6-month anniversary, Jonathan gave Christopher a new hoodie, soft and gray and exactly his size. So you have one that actually fits, he had said without a grin. Christopher had laughed and pulled it on immediately, but later that night, Jonathan had found him wearing the original hoodie, the one that was too big and had started this whole journey. The new one is nice, Christopher had said when Jonathan had raised an eyebrow at his choice. But this one is ours. Jonathan had kissed him then, often sweet and full of love for this man who understood that sometimes the most important things weren't the ones that fit perfectly, but the ones that carried history and meaning and the memory of brave conversations in narrow hallways. A year after that first confession, they moved into a bigger apartment together, one with enough closet space for both of their clothes, though they still shared more often than not. The gray hoodie had a place of honor in their shared dresser, carefully maintained and occasionally worn by both of them when they needed to feel connected to that pivotal night. Jonathan often thought about how different his life might have been if he'd never offered Christopher that hoodie, if Christopher had never been brave enough to keep it, if they'd never had that conversation in the hallway. But then he'd look at Christopher, curled up beside him reading a book or making dinner or just existing in their shared space, and he'd know that they would have found their way to each other eventually. Some love stories began with grand gestures or dramatic declarations. Theirs had begun with a borrowed piece of clothing and a conversation that neither of them had wanted to end. It had begun with the recognition that sometimes the most important things happen in the spaces between words, in the moments when you stopped pretending and started being honest about what you wanted. The hoodie still hung in their closet, a reminder of the night they'd stopped being afraid and started being brave. It was a symbol of the love they'd built together, piece by piece, conversation by conversation, until they'd created something beautiful and lasting and real. Christopher still wore it sometimes when he was feeling nostalgic or when Jonathan was away for war and he missed him. Jonathan still loved seeing him in it, still felt that same flutter in his chest that he'd felt the first time Christopher had pulled it on in the library all those years ago. But more than that, it was a reminder that love could begin in the most ordinary moments, with the most ordinary gestures. It could begin with a friend offering comfort on a cold night, with a borrowed piece of clothing that became a bridge between two hearts that were ready to find each other. It could begin with someone returning a hoodie but staying to talk in a hallway, both of them knowing that what they really wanted was to stay, to connect, to finally acknowledge what had been growing between them for months. Years later, when people asked them how they knew they were meant to be together, Jonathan and Christopher would exchange a look and smile. They'd talk about the hoodie, about the night in the hallway, about the moment they'd stopped being afraid and started being honest. But what they wouldn't say, what they kept just for themselves, was how it had felt to finally stop pretending. How it had felt to look at someone and see your own feelings reflected back at you. How it had felt to take that leap of faith and find that the person you loved was ready to catch you. They wouldn't talk about the months of careful navigation that had followed, learning how to be together in this new way, figuring out how to balance friendship and romance and everything in between. They wouldn't mention the fears they'd had to overcome, the doubts they'd had to work through, the way they'd had to learn to trust that this new thing they'd built was strong enough to last. What they would say was that love could surprise you, could sneak up on you in the form of a friend who became something more. They'd say that sometimes the most important conversations happened in the most unlikely places, that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was admit that you didn't want someone to leave. They'd say that home could be a person, that comfort could be found in borrowed clothes and shared glances, and the knowledge that someone chose you every day, over and over again. The hoodie eventually wore out, as all clothes do with time and love and frequent washing. The fabric became thin and soft. The color faded to a pale gray that was somehow even more beautiful than the original. When it finally became too worn to wear, they kept it anyway, folded carefully in a memory box along with other treasures from their relationship. But by then, they had new hoodies, new shared clothes, new symbols of their love. They had a life together that was built on a foundation of friendship and honesty and the courage to be vulnerable with each other. They had inside jokes and shared dreams in a future that stretched out before them, full of possibility. They had learned that love wasn't just about the grand moments, the dramatic declarations and passionate kisses, though those had their place too. Love was also about the quiet moments, the ordinary gestures, The decision to keep choosing each other even when it was scary or uncertain or new. It was about offering someone your hoodie on a cold night and meaning it as more than just warmth. It was about keeping that hoodie longer than necessary because giving it back felt like losing something important. It was about standing in a hallway and finally being brave enough to say what you'd been feeling for months. It was about recognizing that sometimes the most beautiful love stories were the ones that caught you completely off guard, that grew from friendship into something deeper and more meaningful than you'd ever imagined possible. Jonathan and Christopher's love story had begun with a simple gesture and a borrowed piece of clothing, but it had grown into something extraordinary. It had grown into a partnership built on trust and understanding and the knowledge that they were better together than they were apart. And sometimes on quiet evenings when they were curled up together on their couch, Christopher would pull on one of Jonathan's hoodies, and Jonathan would remember that first night, the way his heart had stuttered at the sight. He'd remember the months of uncertainty and longing, the fear and the hope, the moment when everything had finally clicked into place. He'd remember the hoodie that had started it all, and he'd be grateful for borrowed clothes and brave conversations and love that began in the most unexpected places. He'd be grateful for Christopher, who had taught him that sometimes the most important journeys began with a single step into uncertainty, with the faith that someone would be there to catch you when you fell. Their love story had begun with a hoodie, but it had become something much bigger than that. It had become a life together, a future shared, a love that had grown from friendship into something beautiful and lasting and real. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Not how it had started, but how it had grown. Not the fear they'd felt in the beginning, but the courage they'd found to move beyond it. Not the hoodie itself, but what it had represented, the bridge it had built between two hearts that were ready to find each other. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories were the ones that began with the simplest gestures, the most ordinary moments, the decision to be kind to a friend on a cold night. Sometimes love grew slowly, carefully, in the spaces between words, in the moments between heartbeats, until one day you looked up and realized that everything had changed. Jonathan and Christopher had found that kind of love, the kind that grew from friendship and trust and the courage to be vulnerable with each other. They had found the kind of love that lasted, that weathered storms and celebrated joys and remained constant through all the changes that life brought their way. And it had all started with a hoodie, a conversation in a hallway, and the recognition that sometimes the most important things were the ones you were most afraid to lose. It had started with the decision to be brave, to be honest, to stop pretending and start living their truth. Years later, they would look back on that night in the hallway as the moment their real life together began. Not because the friendship hadn't been real or important, but because that was when they'd finally stopped being afraid of what they meant to each other. That was when they'd finally admitted that what they had was worth fighting for, worth the uncertainty and the fear and the possibility of getting hurt. That was when they'd chosen love over safety, honesty over pretense, each other over the comfortable distance they'd been maintaining. The hoodie had been the catalyst, but the love had always been there, waiting for them to be brave enough to acknowledge it. It had been there in the coffee made without asking, in the casual touches that lingered longer than necessary, in the way they'd always seemed to understand each other without words. It had been there in the months of careful dancing around their feelings, in the way they'd both been afraid to lose what they had but unable to stop wanting more. It had been there in the recognition that what they had together was special, rare, worth protecting and nurturing and celebrating. And now, years later, it was still there. Not just in the memory of that first night, but in the life they'd built together, the love they'd cultivated, the future they were creating day by day, choice by choice, moment by moment. They had learned that love was both simpler and more complex than they'd ever imagined. Simpler because, at its core, it was just about choosing each other over and over again. More complex because that choice had to be made every day in big ways and small ways, in moments of joy and moments of difficulty. But they had also learned that it was worth it, all of it. The fear and the uncertainty and the vulnerability were worth it for the love they'd found, the partnership they'd built, the life they were living together. And sometimes, When Christopher would pull on one of Jonathan's hoodies and curl up beside him on the couch, Jonathan would remember that first night and marvel at how far they'd come. He'd think about the scared, confused young man he'd been, afraid to admit what he was feeling, afraid to risk their friendship for something uncertain and new. He'd think about Christopher, equally scared but brave enough to keep the hoodie, brave enough to have that conversation in the hallway, brave enough to admit that he didn't want Jonathan to leave. And he'd be grateful, so grateful, for borrowed clothes and honest conversations and love that grew from friendship into something beautiful and lasting. He'd be grateful for the courage they'd found to be vulnerable with each other, to take that leap of faith and trust that they would catch each other when they fell. Their love story had begun with a hoodie, but it had become something much more than that. It had become a testament to the power of friendship, to the courage required for honesty, to the beauty of love that grew slowly and carefully and lasted a lifetime. And in the end, that was the most beautiful part of all. Not the dramatic beginning or the passionate declarations, but the quiet, steady love they'd built together day by day, choice by choice, until they'd created something that was uniquely theirs, something that would last no matter what challenges life brought their way. Sometimes the most important conversations happened in hallways, with borrowed clothes and honest words and the courage to finally say what you'd been feeling all along. Sometimes love began with the simplest gesture and grew into something extraordinary. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you found someone who was willing to take that journey with you, to be brave and honest and vulnerable and real. Someone who would choose you every day in big ways and small ways for the rest of your life. Jonathan and Christopher had found that kind of love, and it had all started with a hoodie and a conversation and the decision to stop being afraid. It had started with the recognition that what they had was worth fighting for, worth the risk, worth everything. And that, they both agreed, was the most beautiful beginning of all.